Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, the show about shaping or perhaps reshaping democracy and citizenship in the 21st century. We're always trying to move forward in this show, always trying to imagine a path, an opportunity, a new space for democracy. But it seems ironic, perhaps not so ironic, almost inevitable, that the more we move forward, the more we're really trying to return to something. My guest today on the show, Hélène Landemore, teaches at Yale University. She's originally from Paris, where she's talking to us. She has written an extremely interesting and important new book, Open Democracy. And in the book, Hélène Landemore is trying to go back to move forward. Hélène, is that a fair observation? Are you yourself, you end and begin with the Athenian Pnyx as well as other open spaces. Are you trying to return to something that we've lost?
Yes and no. I am interested in returning us to ancient practices of openness and equal access, certainly, and also in returning us to the practice of random selection, distributing political offices on the basis of one person, one lottery ticket, rather than on the basis of who's capable of winning elections. But at the same time, I think we've learned a lot since ancient Greece and since classical Athens. We've learned from social sciences. We've learned from the successes and failures of modern so-called representative democracies. We've learned also about the difficulties of scale, the competition between states, and also the technology of deliberation. So I think, when I wrote that book, my goal was not just to recreate a sort of a modernized version of Athens. It was really to create something new, borrowing from the best practices that I could identify in the past, and also using my own imagination. I just recently took my students to Mars, and I asked them to design a constitution for Mars. So the idea is not, again, to stay stuck in the past, but really to use our best methods and political theory and social sciences to create something that would work for the 21st century.
In addition to being inspired or interested in the political, perhaps the democratic practices of ancient Greece, you also look to other societies. As you mentioned, you're trying to imagine now a democracy for Mars. But one example that I found particularly interesting in your book was Iceland. I didn't know much about the political practices of Iceland, but you seem to have found something in your work to suggest that the traditional habits of the Icelandic political community over the last 500 years also offers a guidepost to improving democracy in the 21st century. What have the Icelanders been up to over the last 500 years?
Yes, well, exactly. Iceland is another major source of inspiration. And in some ways, they didn't replicate the Athenian model. They came up with their own sort of version of a proto-democratic society, centuries ago. And the concept was that they would meet every year in this open space in the summer and have all the members of the community make decisions collectively on political trials, on basic issues of legislation, distribution of goods, etc. And I think that this culture is so entrenched and ingrained that I think it has spillover effects to this day. And I think that the egalitarian spirit is very strong in Iceland, even under the current model of electoral democracy. So when they finally got their independence in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, from Denmark, they thought they would have their own constitution, but there wasn't much time, so it was put together by bureaucrats who basically did a copy-paste of the Danish constitution. But when the 2008 crisis hit, there was a sort of political meltdown on top of the economic and financial meltdown, and Icelanders thought that this was a time to reinvent themselves, to rewrite their social contract in more inclusive and participatory ways. And that's what they tried to do, at least. They started convening a group of 950 randomly selected citizens who were asked, what do you want to see in this constitution? what values do we want to embed and entrench in our social contract? Who are we? And among the values that came up was the idea of public ownership of natural resources that were not already privately owned, which was actually a real threat to economic interests that were exploiting the resources for free until now. They also wanted to celebrate nature, community, solidarity, etc. Then they gave the recommendations to a body of 25 elected citizens, but the difference between a usual sort of electoral body and that one is that the pool of people from which it was selected, they were elected, excluded professional politicians. They had been by law excluded from running for this election. And so you ended up with a really diverse group that wrote a constitution in 4 months and decided to actually get the feedback of the larger population through crowdsourcing techniques. So it basically consisted in putting their draft versions online and waiting for the larger population to give feedback and give comments and make suggestions. And so they got a different round of feedback that way, included some of the suggestions, including restructuration of the chapters and new ideas like the idea of a right to the internet. And finally, the whole thing went to a referendum in 2012, where 2/3 of the voting population approved of the text as the basis for a new constitution. So this was a remarkably participatory process. The only problem is that Parliament then refused to vote it into law.
Your focus on space is not just physical, but also metaphorical. You talk about diversity in Iceland. You begin your book with a quote from Du Bois, the great 19th century African-American anti-slavery, anti-racist activist. How important is the issue of diversity, not just in intellectual terms, but in cultural and racial terms, to your notions of an inclusive 21st century democracy?
It's important, it's very important, but more as a byproduct of a more fundamental notion of diversity that I called cognitive diversity, after actually Lu Hong and Scott Page, who wrote this book, The Difference, that had quite a bit of an influence on my earlier work. So cognitive diversity, it's really the differences in the ways we approach problems, read the world, really think. Some people approach problems in terms of they have a sort of literary approach to problems, others have a more mathematical and statistical approach to problems. People bring in emotions in different ways. So there's a whole package of cognitive tools that we bring to the table when we problem solve or legislate or think or engage in some kind of intellectual activity. And of course, this diversity, this sort of neurological, you might say, or this mind diversity is going to be colored and influenced by other factors, such as your geographic location, such as your bodily appearance, the color of your skin, the particular experiences you've lived through, all sorts of things that are connected to all forms of diversity that we're used to really caring about, and as we should. But to me, they are sort of proxies for this more fundamental diversity. So for example, when I say that I think it's a bad thing when you have a parliament that doesn't have as many women as there are in the larger population, or as many blacks as there are in the larger population, it's not because I believe that only women can represent women or only blacks can represent blacks. It's because I think that it's a sure sign that you're lacking in the relevant cognitive diversity. It means that you've somehow homogenized your selection process along some lines. And with elections, it will typically be along the lines of wealth, connections, charisma, other things. And you deprive the group of the resources it needs to address very complex issues that will, and of the resources it needs to be able to identify the problems the polity faces as a whole. So it's more like that I approach diversity, if you will.
Hélène, there's been an ongoing debate in our series about what we can learn from the past. We talked about that. We certainly have much to learn about democracy from the direct democratic experiments in antiquity. and perhaps from other societies like Iceland. But the really interesting debate that we've been having is about what we can learn from the indigenous peoples, particularly of North America, the peoples colonized by Westerners, by Europeans, bringing their so-called traditions of democracy, which they believe they inherited from Greece. In terms of the colonial experience, what do you think, in terms of your understanding of democracy, we can learn from indigenous peoples?
Well, I think the most obvious place where we could learn from them in the relationship to nature. Actually, I wasn't thinking of the New World colonization, but I'm thinking of the Aboriginal people of Australia, for example, and they apparently had this really, established traditions of burning forests and sort of like routinely taking care of their environment that way, and that got banned by a hyper-rationalistic state in Australia that saw that as a form of pollution or a sort of a danger potentially for the population sort of settled there. And it turns out that in fact, we've learned now that this sort of a ritualistic or periodic burning of the outgrowth was actually necessary to spare much bigger fires and avoid much larger catastrophes like the ones we've seen last year, where 1 billion animals died and a lot of people were endangered. And so I think there's a lot of knowledge about the relationship with nature that our hyper-rational industrial so-called scientific societies have completely forgotten, and that's one way where we should be humble and sort of try to learn from these indigenous populations.
Are you suggesting then, Hélène, that a healthy democracy is a green democracy?
Yes, I think that's an implication. I think that if we take human beings as integral creatures that are connected to their environment, we have to reconnect with what makes our lives possible. And we are biological creatures before we're anything else. So I do think that a democracy, a good democracy, an authentic democracy has to be green. If you listen to people, where is this call for, more respect for the environment, biodiversity coming from? It's not coming from the corporations. It's not coming from people at the top. It's a grassroots movement. It's people who experience it in their flesh and their lungs and their children's lungs, and they won't change. And they, because they're suffering the consequences of globalization, a certain type of capitalism that is hyper extractive and polluting.
Hélène, one of the things I liked about your book, Open Democracy, is it's not just theoretical, it's not abstract. You focus on a number of different examples of countries, contemporary countries, which are innovating when it comes to democracy. You use this term, epistemic democracy. In addition to Iceland, a couple of other countries, or 3 or 4 countries that you note, other European countries are France, of course, which you know very well, Finland and Estonia. What are the French, the Estonians, and the Finns up to? What can we learn from them? So
the French case is interesting because after we had this revolt of the yellow vests, people who protested the carbon tax that the government tried to implement in November 2018, our President Macron, tried a deliberative approach. He said, well, let's have a great national debate. We're just going to talk to each other for 2 months and figure out what our problems are and what solutions we could implement. So there was a lot of talking for 2 months, so in different formats, open meetings, mini citizens assemblies of 100 people that were selected at random, grievance books, etc. At the end of those 2 months, the president sort of picks and chooses, and it was a somewhat one-sided approach to the interpretation of the results, but at least he comes up with I think a good idea. He says, well, it looks like many of you believe that we need new governance forms, new forms of democratic governance when it comes to environmental issues, because the environment and ecology was a huge sort of like clear-cut sort of desire from the population. So he says, I'm going to give you a citizens' convention for climate, meaning a group of 150 randomly selected citizens who are going to be tasked with co-creating with experts legislative proposals on ways to curb greenhouse gas emissions by X% by 2030. And I promise I'll implement without filtering your recommendations or the recommendations. I will send them directly without filtering again to direct regulation, a referendum, or a parliamentary debate. So he said that, and that's hugely exciting. And the 150, took him seriously, and they went off. And after a year, they came back and they were, well, here are 149 proposals to, accomplish the goal you asked us to accomplish. And some of the proposals were quite radical. For example, one of them was every household should renovate completely their housing and retrofit their housing so that it's energy efficient. We will give people, all kinds of financial aid, but you have to do it. It's mandatory. So global renovation for all. That, of course, didn't go through because Macron and the government didn't dare, basically, to put that on the agenda. But that was a really bold sort of proposal that came out. Other proposals that came out were banning flights that are very short when there are alternatives like the train. So anyway, just to say that for the first time, I think, since I'm looking at these democratic experiments, the citizens, a random sample of them at least, was put in the position of quasi or pre-legislator. And they proved that they were capable of doing that. So what does that tell us? That tells us that potentially, all these ideas that sound fanciful, like mine, like the idea of an open democracy centered, around a randomly selected legislature, are actually feasible. I think they're doable. It's just going to take a lot of courage to devolve power from elected legislatures to these kind of bodies. Interestingly, though, and here I wouldn't look to Estonia or Finland because I don't think they've done anything that bold. They've used technologies and done crowdsourcing in all kinds of interesting ways. But I'm more interested right now in Belgium. Belgium, it's made up. It's a country that has a ton of issues, and they can't solve their cultural differences, and the government was paralyzed for months. But in the German-speaking region, they did something really interesting last year. The parliament, the parliament of the German-speaking region said, we're going to appoint a body of 24 randomly selected citizens as our agenda setter. And whatever they decide, we promise to implement it. And then we will also give them the power to convene 3 citizens' assemblies on topics of their choice. So if they think that immigration is an issue, they can have a citizens' assembly on an issue. If they think something else, the healthcare system needs a reform, they can do that. So, and they did that for a year, and it looks like it worked, and that there were good relations between this parliament and the Council of 24, that it was a sort of smooth process. So the question will be soon, no longer, can we do this? Does it even make sense to devolve so much power to citizens? I think it does. The question is, how do we transition from here to there? How do we get to a system in which ordinary citizens that are selected at random can actually legislate from this place, from this position where elected officials are not going to necessarily want to lose that power, right? So that's for me what we can look forward to seeing play out in countries like Belgium.
In a way, it's a return, isn't it, to the lottery system of antiquity. It's a return to the practices of ancient Greece. For our film, How to Fix Democracy, we actually traveled in the pre-COVID times to Ireland to look at their citizen assembly experiments. What's your view on the Irish initiative? That's probably the one that is best known, particularly when it came to abortion. I know a little bit about Belgium as well, but what is the contribution of the Irish model for citizen assembly?
The Irish assemblies are phenomenal. I wasn't lucky enough to go and sort of witness what happened there, but I've read and studied them indirectly, and what's really interesting is how they very smartly, in a way that was smarter than elsewhere, actually, France or Iceland even, they convinced the existing legislative system to accept the recommendations and see them as an ally rather than competition. So the first Citizens Assembly in 2012 on marriage equality was actually hybrid. They couldn't have, the activists who supported this didn't get a pure randomly selected assembly, but that turned out to be actually for the better. They had 66 randomly selected citizens and 33 politicians. And, you know, from a serious point of view, it seems very impure and unlikely to work. But in fact, it worked beautifully because it created trust between these two constituencies in a way. And when the next crisis came along and they had to deal with the question of the decriminalization of abortion, Parliament thought, oh, well, worked so well in the first case, you know, we had this convention and then there was a referendum on marriage equality passed. Now we're in 2016, we don't know what to do about abortion. Why don't we have again a citizens' assembly? But this time, because we've already seen it up close how it works, we'll just trust the randomly selected citizens to do it on their own. So this time around in 2016, the Citizens' Assembly had 99 randomly selected citizens and no politicians in it. They deliberated, they came up with the proposal to decriminalize abortion, and Parliament embraced that proposal, you know, put a law to a referendum, and it passed, and that's how they changed the constitution. And I think that the lesson from Ireland is really that going back to this question of from here to there, you kind of need to work with the system. You need to get buy-in from the people that are most threatened by these new forms of political participation. And I think Iceland made the opposite, took the opposite strategy and failed for that reason, because they decided they were too pure and didn't want to, you know, sort of like corrupt themselves by engaging in compromises and negotiations with Parliament, and it backfired in a way.
Are you suggesting, Hélène, that real citizenship can't be achieved just from voting every 2 or 4 years or 6 years, that it requires some sort of direct engagement in something like the Irish or Belgium citizen assemblies, that real citizenship in the 21st century means that we can't just behave like consumers every 4 years and throw a vote at a politician who takes our fancy, and instead we need to be responsible. We need to be accountable as individuals within our political systems.
Yes, I think that's what I'm saying, and I am obviously not the only one. I think this is sort of a widespread sentiment that you know, having a say in the form of a vote every 4 years is just too little and too infrequently. We cannot really express all we need to express in order to get what we want with just one vote once in a while, especially when the slate of candidates is something we have little control over. And similarly, we have very little influence on the policy platforms. So I think this lack of real choice and this lack of real voice, you know, creates frustration, anger, resentment, and even a rejection of democracy, you know, to the extent that people think that that's all democracy is about. So I think that that's actually very dangerous, because you risk sullying the ideal by you know, having this very poor implementation of it. So I think we need to be much more ambitious in our institutional design and convince people that no, it's not enough to have a vote once in a while. It's not even a vote on issues most of the time, right? It's a vote on the people who then might or might not take up the issues you care about. So I think that if at least, you know, we had a referendum every year or twice or 3 times a year, and we got to decide on substantive issues like marriage equality, abortion, or immigration, or something that matters, then it would be a different issue. The problem is that when authorities organize referendums, it's usually in manipulative ways to sort of like, you know, trick, you know, people into going one way or another. So Brexit.
It's the Brexit syndrome, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and we have the same situation in France, where referenda have only been used in French history in plebiscitarian ways. So people are very afraid of them. Both the government is afraid of them, and the people don't like them, because they already know that when citizens vote, it's just going to be for or against the government, rather than for or against the actual issue that's on the ballot. So I think the country we need to look to is probably Switzerland, where they have totally mainstreamed the use of referenda, and it's not something that's personal or for or against government. It's authentically about the issue, and I think that's how it should be. And more importantly, even referenda are often initiated by citizens. It's not a top-down affair. It's not a calculation by some politician who think it's going to boost their party, prospect. It's really about, can we gather enough signatures to get this debate going and trigger this referendum because we think this law is bad and needs to be recalled, or because we want to put something on the agenda of Parliament.
Perhaps no coincidence, Hélène, that Switzerland is, of course, the birthplace of JeanJacques Rousseau, the father of, I guess, modern deliberative democracy, one of the great critics of representative democracy. Should people be rereading Rousseau when it comes to all these issues? Is he the father, really, of deliberative democracy?
Well, so I love Rousseau, but he was wrong on so many things. So I'm not sure. I think he had very peculiar views about representation, because in some ways he says representation is slavery, but at the same time his ideal regime form was actually a system in which you had a dormant sovereign, as Richard Tuck would say, and then an aristocracy taking care of the business of politics. So it was not exactly a very democratic system that he had in mind. Plus, I think he would have been fine with plural voting. So his conception of equality and popular sovereignty in the end didn't quite translate into the sort of democratic regime we associate with him for some reason. So no, I'm not sure. So I talk about Rousseau's mistake in my book, and he was also too simplistic in his understanding of the virtues of majority rule. He thought they justified coercing minorities into obedience, and in the name of their civic freedom. I think he got a lot of things wrong, and in a way, as much as I admire him, I think he did a disservice to our understanding of democracy, because it became associated with the tyranny of the majority for many people. And the
idea of the general will, which of course can be deformed and legitimates tyranny of one kind or another.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because both Rousseau and Tocqueville combined, they've actually sort of like established this dogma in political science that democracy, the main danger in politics is the tyranny of the majority. And it's almost as if we've forgotten that the major danger for many, many centuries is, and to this day, is actually the tyranny of the minority, the powerful minority.
What is it about the French that have made them so important in the theoretical history of democracy? Are you naturally a democratic people?
I'm going out on a limb here because it's probably not very founded, but I think it's not the French, it's the Norman in me, and the Norman in Tocqueville, actually, which takes us back to Iceland and the Vikings.
Interesting. So really, it's a Franco-Icelandic axis here.
Yes, because I think that there's an anecdote that I always like to retell about how when the Vikings came down, a Norman sort of a river, they were hailed by passerbys, and they were like, "Who's your master?" And the Vikings said, "We have no master. We are all equals." And they settled in Normandy, and I bet you they influenced the Morris. And I grew up with a very strong sense of equality and the importance of being direct and frank. And then when I traveled the rest of France, it just culturally didn't feel like exactly the same thing. And I suspect that there might be a legacy there. I don't know. It's completely random guess, but I think there might be something there.
We've spoken geographically and culturally. Let's think in terms of generations as well. Do you see a a generational shift? Are we back at a 1968 movement when it comes to young people's engagement and involvement and commitment to politics and citizenship?
It's a great question. I'm not sure the parallel with 68 is the right one, but I do think there's a huge generational gap, because I feel it. I'm Generation X, and I can tell you we were not nearly as radical. And the generation just after us is really radical. I see it in my graduate students, and I think it's partly, almost, you could look at it from a Marxian perspective. It's almost something about class interest. This generation are completely, have been screwed over. I mean, their prospects for, buying a house, having a family, saving, getting a stable job are really limited in a way that even my generation's perspective weren't. I think there's a sort of cliff that these generations fell off.
Even for graduate students at Yale?
Even for graduate students at Yale, graduate students are, yes, they have better prospect than most, but it's not an easy situation to be in. Postdocs, these are all precarious sort of positions, and sure, they're the elite of that kind of population. But if they themselves, feel such vulnerability, you can imagine that for everyone else it's much worse. And the only reason why they're so vocal is because they have the luxury to be vocal. They study, they think, they have time, they're paid, not much, but they're paid to write dissertations, and they look at the world and they're incensed, and rightly so. So I actually think that they might save the world in a way that our generations did not.
They are, as you suggested, living a precarious life. A lot of people have called them the new Prokaryote. They're selling their labor on new digital platforms. This is, of course, the generation of the internet, digital natives, who are both, this economy, this precarious economy has been created by the digital revolution. And they're also participants in it. What is the role of the internet here? Is it the problem or the solution, or both, or neither?
Technologies, again, are neutral. And from my perspective, if we had a better democracy, then we could even use them to augment our capacity for deliberation. So for example, when I'm looking back at the Great National Debate, for example, it was very low tech. There was a basic online platform that wasn't very conducive to deliberation, actually. But there are all these tools out there to put people in touch with each other. Now we're all on Zoom now, and surely we could use artificial intelligence as well to sort of help us process all the data that are generated in such mass, consultations and deliberative experiments. Yet we don't do it somehow. All the smarts and money goes to creating more addictive entertainment, with apps and platforms. And why are we paying people to create these things? Why aren't we paying people to develop tools to augment our democracies? Why isn't the money going there? And that's not a technological question; it's a political and economic question.
It is, of course, but there are some countries which are being more innovative than others when it comes to digital democracy. Estonia comes to mind, and also Taiwan. Have you looked at either of those countries when it comes to their pioneering of digital democracy and digital citizenship?
So I don't know why these countries were so good at it. Maybe because they're small and kind of out of the mainstream. I'm not sure. I think sometimes it comes down to extremely brilliant individuals like Audrey Tang in Taiwan, who has managed to cultivate an approach to politics that's like, punk rock and anarchist and inclusive and participatory and digital at the same time. It's quite remarkable. She's, trying to.
This is the Prime Minister of Taiwan.
She's the Prime Minister of technologies, of digital technologies of Taiwan, and she. Her aim is to basically make the government as transparent and accountable and participatory as possible, while at the same time delivering, services in a fast, fun, and fair way, as she always puts it. And it's working. And I think there's a lot that we could learn from her example. In Estonia, I don't know as well the situation there. I think they have very innovative ideas about e-citizenship, and they're trying to attract also capital and investment that way. I think it's working nicely. All of that should be copied and tried out. Of course, there are all these security issues that also need to be worked out. But I think that, again, if you have the money to, protect Goldman Sachs transactions, why don't we have the money to protect online voting and online deliberation?
Well, let's end, Hélène. This has been a wonderfully expansive, open conversation. You, as the author of Open Democracy, I would expect nothing less. The subtitle of your book is Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century. Let's talk over the next 5 years. Give me a couple of really concrete things that can be achieved over the next 5 years to open up democracy.
Well, I think I believe in starting at the grassroots level and building up, if you will. So I think that we could start socializing our children, into this new mode of approaching democracy. So having, delegates, class delegates chosen at random rather than through electoral methods would be one way to start, so that everyone really gets a chance to test their leadership abilities and to play a role and feel important and useful. We could also rethink our education system so that it fosters more cooperative and collaborative qualities. I think that as a teacher, I for years I've asked students to give me assignments that are written by one student at a time, and I reward them in function of how they compare to the others, and so it's actually a sort of a zero-sum game all the time. But in society, we're all in it together, so why don't we try to encourage collaboration, participation, building on all the qualities that each of us bring to the table instead of constantly comparing and competing. And so that's what I tried to do with my end of term assignment of writing a constitution for Mars, where I said, look, you're going to have the same grade. Your grade will be whatever I assess the value of that project is at the end. And I think not all of them contributed equally. Some took more burden, and others who were not doing well also during this pandemic were carried by the group. But I feel like it's a good metaphor for what society should be about, actually. And so I think that just teaching them that, I feel like is something that will make a difference in their lives, hopefully. So that these are very small ways in which you can start. Then you can also just push for having a citizens' assembly at the city level where you live, and then if we do that everywhere in 5 years, there will be greater movements for larger citizens' assemblies at the national level, the federal level, the global level even. And I encourage your audience to check out, things like this climate assembly, this global climate assembly that's going to take place in the margins of the COP26 in Glasgow. It's a pilot, but I think that's a beginning. And on climate change, it's unthinkable that we continue trying to approach the problem in this very elitist way, when we have to have conversation about the north-south divide in responsibilities about climate change and how we're going to find solutions that work for everyone. So these are some ideas that come to mind.
Well, Hélène Landemore, the author of Open Democracy, Professor of Political Science at Yale University, I really want to thank you for a wonderfully expansive, interesting conversation. You've certainly opened many of our viewers and listeners' mind to open democracy, to deliberative democracy. Congratulations, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Andrew. It was a pleasure.